Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast is listener-supported independent media. Please pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please like, share, and subscribe on YouTube. Issa Blumi returns to the show. We talk about the current state of affairs in the Gulf states and the region during the economic crisis and the lockdowns for COVID-19. We also talk about the UAE-Israel deal, the evolution of the geopolitical landscape in the Middle East, the war in Yemen, and the rivalry between Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Turkey. We discuss the increasing influence of China in the region, and we also talk about media coverage and how it's heavily influenced by various sources of funding. There's a bonus question for patrons at the end of the interview on China's increasing influence in the Middle East and whether they will be a savior for the Global South. That's episode 180 Extra, Will China Be the Savior of the Global South? Dr. Issa Blumi is an historian, an author, and a professor of global history, Islamic world, Ottoman Empire, Yemen, and Albania. His very prescient book titled Destroying Yemen, What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the World, tells the story of the wars in Yemen, but also, quote, ultimately tells an even larger story of today's political economy of global capitalism, development, and the war on terror as disparate actors intersect in Arabia, unquote. We recorded this on August 30th, 2020. Issa Blumi is here. He's back on the show speaking to us from the region, the Middle East. Hello, Issa. It's great to talk to you again.
Joanne, it's nice to hear your voice, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to share some thoughts with you in a good, interesting conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Always enjoy talking with you, and you've given me a lot of insight into more complicated relationships, things that are, in my view, not explained well in the media and even in sort of the think tanks here in the U.S. And I really appreciate that. And so in the past, we've talked about Yemen, we've talked about the Gulf states and their complicated relationships, the developing economic issues and power struggles. And it seems like things are changing. We have a new situation, and maybe we can start our talk on the new deal that's been announced between the UAE and Israel, because I suspect that there's a much bigger picture. I'm also very curious about Saudi Arabia. I skimmed through the headlines today, and they're very superficial. They talk about tourism is improving in Saudi Arabia. I thought that seems unlikely, but I don't know, maybe it's true. They talk about, issues with the oil prices, always problematic for the Saudis, but they talk about other things, about how the gaming scene is really exploding in Saudi Arabia, even with women. And I don't know, it seemed kind of very, very PR-ish. So I guess the other big thing is that Pompeo and Trump said that they expect that the Saudis will join the UAE in, expanding relations or repairing relations or developing relations with Israel. So I thought maybe we would start there to hear your thoughts on it and, what you think, what you think's happening, and is this a change, and does this signal anything is there a signal we should take from this?
In many ways, what has been made public and declared certainly meant to at least communicate in the United States very much to and cater to a domestic political dynamic, certainly. I'm not quite sure strategically it has any enduring consequences for the parties that publicly announced they've now recognized formal diplomatic relations and will now proceed to explore commercial as well as strategic military cooperation. This is something that's been going on for actually quite a long time already. It's not a very well kept secret. Indeed, periodically from the 90s onwards, whether it be under Bush Jr., the Obama administration, or the Clinton administrations before that, there have been moments of thawing. Again, it's a very useful kind of political gesture in the United States domestic political context. It at one point would have unleashed outrage in other parts of the world, but one almost can barely hear a whisper of complaint. Now, that may be a reflection of the fact that media is so controlled by certain parties, but even those who want to exploit this and demonstrate just how weak the UAE or Saudi Arabia or Sudan are, the new government in Sudan, Qatar and Turkey. Turkey still maintains very good relations, especially in terms of trade. Most likely they cooperate militarily. They certainly have similar ambitions with dividing up the Eastern Mediterranean regarding oil and gas offshore. Qatar and Israel have long worked together, and I think there's no room for outrage. Unfortunately, the stakes for the few actors who are still at war and fighting what they see as a common enemy. This also doesn't come as a surprise, and indeed you see very little attempt to exploit this from whether it's from Iran or from North Yemeni media. So let's say at the public level, there's really this has left very little impression. There have been some public missteps. There were gestures from radicals in the Likud party said that they will not sanction the sale of military weapons, which is something that I know and I've observed from the Trump administration from the very moment they came to power, is that they've changed the direction of diplomacy regarding the Arabian Peninsula. I've mentioned this before on air, and certainly I've written about it in the book. The overt threats of we're in the business of bringing American contracts to American companies that especially involves the military-industrial complex and oil companies and suppliers of these industries, and we are basically making a demand on all the countries that are involved in the region that they will have to dedicate their resources to making sure previous contracts were paid and new contracts will be made. And you see a dramatic hike in military equipment sales, certainly the use of mercenary operations, whether it's logistics, supply chain management, or indeed boots on the ground, whether it be was it Blackwater? I get the names mixed up from the investment
Blackstone,
outfit.
maybe.
Blackstone, yes,
Yeah.
which is based in the region. There are plenty of offshore intelligence security operations, whether based in Tel Aviv or elsewhere in the world, that have been solicited. Their resources, their capacities have been solicited for the war in Yemen for the last 5 years. And this most recent news about setting up surveillance operations on various islands, both in the Red Sea and off the coast in the Western Indian Ocean, should not be anything new either. If one follows the kind of the industry's media and how they talk about the new contracts and who's getting what, this has been going on for a while already. The use of certain kinds of experimental weapons most likely were facilitated by especially Saudi Arabia in dropping some of these ordinances that on northern Yemen at various points in time. And this will continue. Unfortunately, does nothing to resolve the underlying conditions of war in Southern Arabia. It consolidates the range of possible arms purchases in the future. There will be further investment, or hope that to be further investment with new influx of borrowed money into some local economies. This is why you see constant efforts in media to pitch the idea that there's a booming gaming industry in Saudi Arabia, and that there's an internal tourism industry just waiting to be tapped into. This is some way to try to create an interest in bringing some outside money into these industries, which are moribund at this stage, and things have not in any ways improved in this region. The continued oil prices being suppressed as they are, the continued costs, the demands from the United States and the Trump administration to continue finding ways to raise more revenue, to buy more weapons and other services from United States companies has meant persistent drain on all the economies in the region. So we're seeing almost a convenient emphasis on the crisis around COVID-19. It's provided some kind of cover for what would otherwise be a very open discussion about the conditions, the economic conditions in these countries. So for now, people are in lockdown. People are concerned about their health. Schools are now opening up again, so people are worried about taking their kids to school. Their solutions are being discussed. In some ways, there's a new market niche for some of these industries that are emerging and services that are emerging due to lockdown and due to public health initiatives that keep people isolated. And there are plenty of places to investigate what's going on in the region in this regard, and I recommend listeners to take a couple hours and take a look at how these regional economies are performing since March, at least. Now, in respect to the campaign in Yemen, the same issues that we've discussed in the past, very much contentious, very loosely or conjoined coalition that are more at odds with each other than unified in confronting the Yemeni resistance in the north of the country. There have been very few successes on the ground for the so-called coalition. The biggest success that can be argued, as far as they're concerned, is on the political side, bringing the constant warring factions together. The Southern Transitional Council, which is largely derived from old members of the old South Yemen state, who want to create a separate, independent country, and have long been rivals to the Saudi-supported coalition elements on the ground, as well as the Qatari ones, the Islah Party and the Muslim Brotherhood. They, for a very brief moment, a couple of weeks ago, signed kind of a peace agreement, and that very quickly broke apart on the grounds that money was not circulating and salaries were not paid, and bills that were long overdue were still not addressed. And so we're back to square one in that regard. And in the meantime, the Northern Alliance, which is often phrased in Western media as the Houthis or Ansar Allah, have made considerable gains on the ground in areas where it had initially in 2015, when they overthrew the Hadi European American UN imposed interim government on the grounds of corruption, and that Hadi was leading the country to permanent economic and financial servitude to global markets. They had successfully removed much of the Al-Qaeda Daesh forces that had been entrenched for 20, 30 years in a province called Baida, which is north of Aden. After the coalition got their act together and brought in tens of thousands of mercenaries and used all kinds of sophisticated weapons, they pushed back the coalition. And they have now regained some of these territories. 1,500 square kilometers have been captured in the last couple of weeks in Baida region. In Marib region further north, which is really encroaching on some of the now oil and gas production of that part of Yemen. Also, the North Yemeni Alliance has scored major military victories, in large part because the so-called coalition led by the Americans, or organized by the Americans and British via the Saudis and others, just don't have the means, the capacity on the ground. Their manpower issues are a continuous headache. They're not reliable. There's, again, much infighting, the problems of not receiving salaries, the fact that in many cases this war has been dragging on for so long for some of these communities that have to host these military operations has led to conflicts with indigenous local host communities. So unfortunately, we're at a stalemate with some major successes on the ground. They will not translate into military victory, unfortunately. We will not see any kind of resolution to this horrible humanitarian catastrophe. We still have the problems of starvation. We still have the problems of upwards of 20 million people being completely isolated from the larger world. This embargo that has been imposed and by the coalition with the help of American, British, NATO navies, and certainly with the airplanes, and even with the United Nations. Martin Griffiths, who's the so-called UN Special Envoy, has made it quite clear on numerous occasions that he's not going to criticize the performance of the so-called coalition at the diplomatic level. And now we have this potential of this catastrophe with this marooned ship full of oil off the coast of Hodeidah, which there's fears that it'll break up at any time and create a catastrophe that will match what happened up in Alaska in the 1980s. A similar kind of potential disaster, which will in many ways serve the interest of the coalition, make it basically impossible for northern Yemenis, who still control large parts of that western coast of Yemen, if anyone looks at the map, the fisheries, the whole ecology of that part of Yemen will be destroyed, and make the embargo that much more effective. The siege of northern Yemen that much more effective. And if I may add, sadly, the war over the last 5 years, very cynically using air power to take out the very elaborate systems of dams that northern Yemenis have perfected over so many hundreds of years, destroying much of the capacity to retain floodwaters. We have just now passed through one of the monsoon periods, and we've seen horrible pictures coming from northern Yemen of massive floodings, entire villages being washed out, neighborhoods in Sana'a itself being flooded, and worse, it's destroyed many of the farmlands, which were increasingly successful in being at least able to bring a minimum amount of food to the 18 to 20 million people who are under siege in the north. So we're not quite sure where the extent of the damage due to these last season of monsoon rains, but it's not likely that there will be um, a good season of farming. And this is going to be, as every year, a big struggle to actually feed 18, 20 million people in northern Yemen. And again, there's been long struggles with the United Nations. This very cynical use of expired foods that were delivered. There's plenty of documented cases of huge piles of food supposedly delivered to feed northern Yemenis that is actually um, not consumable because of the vermin and the other kinds of horrible diseases that were found in these piles of so-called donated food. So the struggle is a military one, but it's also one that hits at the economy, at the belly of those people who are supporting still till to this day this resistance to what I called in the book empire. And so for the next 6 months, it's a wait and see. We're going to have economic catastrophe intensified throughout the world. It certainly has hit the region very hard as well. But as far as Yemen is concerned, what has just happened because of the flooding, and perhaps what may happen with this container ship filled with oil, if it actually breaks apart, we may see some terrible consequences in 3 to 6 months on the population in the north, who are, again, starving to death already. So there's no one's keeping an accurate count. This is counterproductive as far as the coalition is concerned. The UN is more than happy to comply, with the exception of a couple of smaller international agencies, especially the Norwegians. Everyone else is trying to suppress numbers, trying to keep this off the radar screen, if you will, of people like you and others who actually do care what's happening in Yemen.
Yeah,
Sorry, I
that
went off on a long rant.
no, I'm always interested in Yemen. Uh, it's one of the most depressing issues that I've ever seen in my lifetime, and it just never seems to get. I thought there was not much more they could do to Yemen. I didn't even know about the systematic destruction of dams. I didn't think there was much more that left to do to destroy these people, but I'm speechless over that. Um,
And again, the fact that
I really
it's
am.
not, it's, yeah, the fact that the same ones who are now providing kind of marketing opportunities, once again selling the investment opportunities for these countries, who, and then in the meantime report nothing about this human story, is it's quite telling. We really are in bad shape in the world. We're not in good hands, that's for sure.
Is there any kind of a limbo till the 2020 election? It has that feel to it. Not only has the COVID-19 situation sort of put a lot of things on hold, but there seem to be people for Iran, for example. They're they have made it clear that they're not going to do any kind of negotiations with the Trump administration, and they're waiting and hoping that there'll be a new administration in January. Whether or not that's a wise decision to think that anything significant will happen with a new administration, given the sort of continuity of in foreign policy. Although with Iran, I have to say there is a stark difference between one side and the other, if you will. Um, I guess I also wanted to ask about with the UAE-Israel deal. One of the, I mean, there's all kinds of development of economic ties, economic relations. As you said, this is something that's sort of now coming to the surface or being acknowledged publicly when really in the back rooms was already happening. But the promise, the one thing I can see on Israel's side, what they are agreeing to is to put a hold on the annexation of the West Bank, which hadn't happened yet, which was part of a very shaky Jared Kushner Trump deal, um, and kind of an interesting thing to offer. Something they didn't have any legal right to do to begin with. They're saying, all right, we won't do it. It was already very controversial, difficult for them to actually carry out. It makes me wonder whether did they ever really intend to put a hold, to fully annex the West Bank, or, is this a fig leaf, or is this like a, what do you think of the things that Israel has promised in this deal?
Uh, I, I'm at a loss about how to make it sound, let's say, sophisticated or shrewd. I just think they're just criminals, and they've always been criminals, especially those operatives that are around Netanyahu. One has to also recall that Netanyahu's not a very popular figure in domestic politics at this stage, and has long relied on the United States to shore up factions within the United States political elite to shore up his very
Shaky.
shaky hold on power. The moment he's out of power, of course, he goes to the courtroom, and he may end up being thrown in jail, as others prominent politicians in that Zionist state have faced in the past. Joanne, I'm really sorry. I don't know what else more to say. What can we expect from that place? They did annex Golan. They're exploiting the resources in Golan. Nothing has been, not a finger has been raised from either party. I think the Democratic Party's candidates have made it quite clear that they're not going to change one iota the relationship between the United States and this enterprise there in the East Mediterranean. In respect to places like Yemen, I think one has to remember that it's throughout the period the Democrats were in power, and at least in the White House, it's they who pursued this policy of destroying Yemen, and indeed initiated the coalition once their puppet was thrown out of power by the uprisings of 2014, 2015. So things will definitely not get better for Yemen, regardless of who takes power. And
Yeah.
Iran, unfortunately, is an incredibly cynical apparatus, which has its own kind of very deep tensions domestically, politically. It certainly played itself out with the assassination of Soleimani in in Baghdad, and maybe it's not enough time to talk about what's happening in Syria and Iraq, and the continued occupation. There most likely will be yet another phase to the battles over northern Syria that certainly has consequences and implications in neighboring countries. We saw this still very debated disaster with Beirut. I would suggest people to consider Pablo Escobar, is it?
Yeah.
What's his name?
Hmm.
Yes,
Pablo Escobar. Yeah.
yeah, in The Saker, he wrote something just
Pepe.
recently
I'm
that
sorry, Pepe
Pepe,
Escobar. Yeah.
yes, my apologies. Yeah, he wrote something recently that makes a lot of sense. There are others who also identified the kind of the operatives who have stepped up or have, let's say, adapted to various contingencies that have been caused by the fact that some regimes or some enterprises, some zones of resistance have not been successfully destroyed, both in northern Yemen, in Syria, in southern Lebanon, and elsewhere. The wars between Turkey and its some of the countries in the larger region, whether it plays itself out in Syria, in northern Iraq, or Libya, in Somalia. Turkey has been a major player, and its partners Qatar, which has once again, it's hard to find any reference at all to one of the major players in this larger game. A terrifying game that's been being played out since the 90s, and I find that also telling that the think tanks, who have very narrow frame to which to operate and disseminate information, continuously reveal their benefactors by not talking or not evoking their participation in this process. So it's muddied. It requires a lot of reading across very different channels of analysis, and unfortunately, the way I'm reading in the United States in particular is the level of partisanship, the level of either or kind of politics has distorted how people actually analyze things, and that's certainly the case with respect to West Asia, and especially Yemen. The fact that it's been more or less a black hole in much of academia, in much of the production and journalism of journalists, whether it be freelance or those who are with major news corporations. It's all very telling to me sitting here from afar. Let alone what's happening in the European media. This is more or less the same thing.
Yeah, I've noticed that over time, but I can't really say why, but yeah, there are people who just can't speak about certain things. That's a good time to. I've got a question from one of our listeners who a number of people have been asking to hear from you again. So I'm really glad that you were able to make this time in a difficult situation. But I'll give you this question from one of our listeners. They talked about the last time you were on the podcast, you thought the direction that things were going in was that the tensions between Saudi Arabia and Qatar were going to improve. They were going to thaw at the expense of the UAE. But it doesn't seem, at least from the outside looking in, to have happened, at least not yet. And he says, we've even seen this spill over into the world of sports as the Saudis lost out on buying the English Premier League team, Newcastle United, because they banned the Qatari network, Beln, I guess. The question would be, do you still think that the thawing did not materialize? What has changed in the geopolitical landscape in the region, since then, since almost a year ago? And then he's got a follow-up question after that.
It's hard to say. They seemed, now I'm speaking about Doha and Riyadh, seem to be on more cooperative. They're more cooperative in cases like Yemen, and you can see that that cooperation hurting the attempts at trying to create some kind of stability within this larger coalition. I mentioned at the very beginning there was this brief moment where they basically agreed to stop shooting at each other in the areas that are under their extended control. But the fact that, for instance, these major recent battles have gone the way of the northern Yemenis in these areas where there's large numbers of Daesh, Al-Qaeda, even though they were getting air cover by Saudi forces and helicopter cover, they still lost out large swaths of land, lots of equipment, lots of men were killed, a lot of people were arrested. And it should have been an embarrassment. It should have been an expose yet again of who's supporting these so-called terrorist organizations that the rest of the world is expected to fear. And to a lesser extent, that plays itself out in other regional conflicts. Not the case in places like Libya, not the case in the context of the Syrian war. So one has to actually take this approach by looking at case by case. It's certainly, I think it remains the same, that it's not going to be these three countries, major countries in the region. At some point, there's going to be a financial collapse, and not all three will be left standing. The Trump administration really initiated this kind of scramble, and that's, again, why the coalition very overtly broke apart in 2017. But I can see much more possibilities of Mohammed bin Salman and Doha making amends if the calculations and the conditions were necessary, especially with Turkey being such a major player and extending its influence again to the Horn of Africa, keeps pushing and is being used as a lever of pressure on especially the UAE in the Horn of Africa, in Libya, in Syria. You've seen realliances being made in again, doesn't make any sense if you just look and focus on, for instance, relationship between Israel and some of these countries, or the United States and these countries. But depending on the specific theater, if you will, then you can see in some ways there is a thawing. In other places, the differences are still too great to cross. But it's certainly still a three, often very conflicted group of actors who only on paper are sharing similar interests in places like Yemen, but are completely separate and are actually on opposite ends in these multi-front battles in places like Syria and Libya, in the Horn of Africa. And this will only play itself out further, and certainly Israel is exploiting this. Certainly the Trump administration exploits this. It doesn't hurt that the Democratic Party, at least very powerful elements of the Democratic Party, who, for instance, imposed Biden on a constituency that, as far as I could read from afar, certainly the last person they wanted to represent the party would be this guy. Clearly doesn't have the capacity to phrase his own a sentence or two on his own. And then this Kamala Harris, who also very more complicated actor, but still hardly the candidates to reassure people who wanted to see significant change in both the United States and domestically, and how the United States operates overseas. So that's my very, again, long-winded answer to this, that it depends on where we're looking. They have come to some kind of mutual agreements in regards to sharing the struggle in southern Arabia, to assure that it's one of the three major actors trying to secure victory in Yemen does not, let's say, ascend above the other two. And I think within the Trump administration, you have big divisions within. Pompeo is an old CIA guy. He certainly was not somebody allied with Trump, the personality. I think the Trump administration is a very, very contentious one. It reminds me in many ways, like I'm just reading this Talbot book about Dulles and his relationship with
Yeah.
Kennedy.
Yeah.
Um, I wouldn't in any ways compare Trump with JFK, but I think we often make the mistake of thinking about administrations as coherent units, and there is indeed big, powerful elements in the larger American empire apparatus that are still up for grabs, even this far down in the Trump administration period. I don't think Pompeo and these others, and many elements of the military industrial complex, um, are on the same wavelength with the people around Trump. And it's hard to tell who's who regarding Israel. I think it's smart domestic politics as far as both the Democrats and and Trump's people. The fact that there was this huge defection of neocons to embrace the Democrats, I think, should be very worrying for progressives in the Democratic Party.
Mm,
It says a lot about what the Democratic Party, at least what this Biden and Kamala Harris represent. You're not going to see changes in the Middle East if if there's a change in the White House, um, and that has an effect on explicitly this relationship between these three Arabian powers in many parts of the larger world.
right. Yeah. The factional nature of things in the U.S. and no doubt other places makes it really difficult to sort it out. Now, I have a follow up question from the listener, and then I have a bonus question for you that'll be for patrons. So the follow up question is something you've already touched on a little bit. Maybe we can get into a little bit more specifics. He says the second question would be, given how unreliable most media coverage of the Middle East can be, what sources do you use on a daily or regular basis to stay informed on developments in the region? Maybe you could throw out a few suggestions for people who are seeking, a broader, as you have already said, you have to read multiple perspectives. You really have to dig, and then you have to, use your own critical thinking skills to put together what you think makes the most sense and find people you can trust. Much more difficult as time goes on. But anyway, what do you think about that question?
You said it very well. One needs to be a critical reader, and just unfortunately assume that either people have already committed themselves to write content. Now that we're talking about now, either journalists or academics, to write content that is either expected of them because of who pays their salaries. In many cases, it's a very simple um, little bit of investigation and figuring out which of the countries in the region support which universities, which think tanks, and this has been exposed on numerous occasions. Which newspapers, so Washington Post, you can associate with Middle East Eye and Qatar. And that extends to Agence France Presse and to a lesser extent Reuters. You can see a pattern in how they report. And I think if one were to start this afresh without any, let's say, previous knowledge, one could actually start charting these things, literally on a piece of paper, making note of how frequently there was an opportunity to write and bring in certain elements, and they just did not show up in the analysis of, let's say, the war in South Arabia or the events that are happening in Libya. I think it's going to be interesting. It will be a new, let's say, shuffle, if you will. There certainly is divisions emerging in the larger NATO alliance in respect to, obviously, Gazprom and the politics of fuel supply over the next 20, 30, 40 years, what's happened in Belarus, what happened in the Balkans over the summer. It plays itself out also in the larger East Mediterranean world. Turkey and Greece are yet again chasing each other's warplanes and ships around, and the EU has issued a warning to Turkey to ratchet it down a bit. The politics of gas pipelines through Syria plays itself out and exposes the rivalries and the tensions in larger Europe and how it plays itself in U.S. domestic politics, and then plays itself out in what people write. So that's kind of a lame answer. I know that you want specifics, but I think it's something that I don't have full command of on the top of my head. I could go through my phone now or go through my email accounts and tell and mention names that I follow, but that would also almost lead to either promoting or sanctioning what they either retweet or what they comment on and how they frame it. And more importantly, because I have much of my life has been spent in the region, I have relied on personal contacts who have really helped remind me and give me fresh what's going on the ground in many places in the region, which I can't in any ways articulate in an answer, in the form of an answer. So I will have to resort again to the suggestion that one read broadly, recognize a pattern. I think, especially with American media, the sides have already been neatly laid out. It's quite clear that some think tanks have Doha money, other think tanks have Riyadh money or Abu Dhabi money, and they more or less reflect that. Universities, look at which university have campus in Doha, for instance. There's quite a few of them, Georgetown and Texas A&M, and look at who has been providing funds for the Clinton Foundation, for instance, or look at those who advocate for and push for removal of the Assad government in Syria over the last 12 years, and you can I think, get a general idea of how these positions vis-a-vis reporting on the Middle East or writing about it as an academic translates to affiliations, whether it be formal or informal. The Muslim Brotherhood is an important component to always think, and I think it's an interesting story it's very hard to report on and do research on, because so many universities and individual scholars have been implicated in its revival, if you will, in the 1990s, and it of course exploded in the mid 2000s. The phenomenon of Al Jazeera being English in particular, being often a very reliable and an interesting medium to understand and look at the world. Some very talented journalists have made their early parts of their career with it, and they have remained naively, perhaps, very loyal and relied very much on people who still work for this organization to give them an idea about how to think about certain things. And I'll give you just a very quick personal example. You want to look at how regularly various sources report or do not report on things. So, for instance, the book that I wrote, one would think that it would at least attract some attention, and it's literally has received 3 reviews in academic journals since its release in the beginning of 2018. One review was so terrified about the consequences of giving it an approval that they actually wrote an anonymous book review for a Middle East journal, I think it was. So that tells you that people prefer not to touch certain topics, not to engage in debates about certain things that could get out of control. So I'm actually not dealing with factional wars at all in regards to Yemen. People have just decided to ignore me at the academic level. It's that's not. I think there's a term now in the United States popular culture. It's what is it called? When you shut somebody out.
Cancel culture.
Cancel culture. Yeah. So that's Yemen has been canceled. The story of Yemen has been canceled from many media. And the points of emphasis now is the misdirection, if you will. We're focused on Corona. We're focused on Black Lives Matter. We're focused on many things in the United States. So who has time to think about these real human catastrophes out there? And it's nothing new with Yemen. And we had this with Central Africa. Even with the benefit of hindsight, we still know very little of the extent of the devastation. And more importantly, the primary agents who benefited from this. Think about the coup in Bolivia. Who are the primary actors who've benefited on this? Has anyone in the left, in the progressive media, written about what happened in Bolivia? Is anyone talking about what happens in Bolivia right now? No.
Well, one person is, and I just talked to him a week ago.
Okay.
Yeah,
Excellent. Well,
Ben.
you would of course find.
Well, Ben Norton's in
Norton,
Nicaragua,
yes.
and and there are a few people, but I said the same thing to him. I said, Ben, I think you're the only American journalist that's sort of telling the real story about this. But yeah, overall, you're right. But I'll just take that chance to plug my recent interview with Ben on that subject. Yeah. But yeah, I totally understand what you are getting at there. And you did mention Pepe Escobar, who is still pretty much, he doesn't seem to have changed that much. But that's the other thing. Like, I noticed that, when I started, this has been a years long task to develop sources of information that I thought were credible. Or at least if they did have a bias, they were somewhat open about it, because everyone has biases. I can deal with that. But the one thing I found over time was that I used to have a go-to media outlet. One would be more trustworthy than the other. Yeah. That changed. Then I had to look for individuals within those media outlets who were still somewhat credible. And that is still pretty much what you have to do. You have to identify people who have trustworthy information or have good sources and things like that. Now, over the last 4 years, a lot of that has changed because there's just a completely irrational, partisan nature, factional nature of things going on here that has made things even more skewed, and even some of the most reliable, credible journalists and other people just kind of went off the rails. So I really,
if I can
really
just say very quickly, Joan,
yeah.
It happened to the region, the larger West Asia region, whether it be in Turkey or the larger Arabic-speaking world as well. At some point in time, just people felt that they had to take consistently a position, a side, in a larger battle that actually did not reflect the nuances that was required in many different things. So we have to be weary of following people who have strengths but then weaknesses elsewhere. Hello, are you there?
Exactly. Yeah. I agree.
And just quickly, if I can suggest it, then anybody who really is interested in seeing, at least on Twitter, what I follow, just look me up and then look at the things that the other I don't know the terminology. I'm getting very tired here of who I follow, and maybe that could be a start. Again, I don't take any of the people that I'm following and regularly reading their content as the word of God, but I find it useful to explore a variety of participants in this Twitter universe. So if your listener is still expecting something definitive, to just look at the people that I'm following on Twitter, and they can then decide which ones are interesting or not.
Yeah, that's good. Okay. Just a little aside. Some people I know who came here from Eastern Europe long ago, decades ago, very pro-American, overall, very rational people, but very pro-American, but in recent years have said things like it's starting to remind them of life under the boot of the USSR. It's a very no trustworthy information, increased corruption, and authoritarian in nature. And so one of the casualties of that is information. So yeah, it's a hard question to answer overall. So I have one more. I want to let you go here. I have one more question for you, just a broad question. Is a bonus question for patrons, and I'd like to talk about how most of the discussion and analysis around the Middle East, the Gulf states, and so on, is the U.S. is always at the center of this, almost, as if they're driving everything. But more and more, there's a more quiet actor, which is China, that I think is having a huge impact on things. It's not talked about that much. I think they prefer to operate quietly. But I think that some of the uncertainty, some of the surprising changes are probably due to China's influence in the region. For one just small example, well, actually big example, is that it seems to me that countries in the Middle East would bend to the will of the rich Gulf state countries because of a desperate need for funding, for reconstruction or for development or for whatever. And of course, then the more corrupt side of it, of people being paid off and so on. Whereas China has emerged as an alternative source to look to try to improve their own situations. And it seems to me, and I don't know enough about it, but it seems to me that has changed the situation and made it more difficult to analyze, actually. And I just wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on that. Am I way off? And what you think about it. The answer to the bonus question is in an extra bonus segment for patrons. So you can find that at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or at the website aroundtheempire.com. Episode 180 Extra, Will China Be the Savior of the Global South? And I have to say that I think all of the bonus segments are good. Some of them are very good, but I think this one is particularly interesting. Like really interesting. I'm not great at marketing. I don't like it. Not my forte. But I'm starting to provide more bonus material for patrons as is necessary for independent media like this, funded solely by listeners, because I appreciate them and they make it possible to pay the overhead costs of the show, compensate a little bit for the labor that goes into it. So that's my tease. I hope some of you will subscribe, become patrons of the podcast on Patreon to get these kinds of extras. There's also some full episodes for patrons only. We now have a Discord channel for patrons. And I hope to do some live stream sessions for patrons, Q&A, and where we can just discuss things among ourselves. The thing is, I've pushed my equipment to its limit at this point. I need to gear up a new computer and some other things to start producing good video content. So that is kind of slowly in the works. And now I'll continue with the interview wrap-up. I know it's very late where you are, and I very much appreciate you taking the time, as always. And if you would, make sure that people know where to find you and how to support your work.
Yeah. Thank you again, Joanne, so much for giving me the opportunity. It's always nice to hear your voice and hear your own thoughts about things. And I'm always pleased to hear the kinds of questions you raise. And thanks to your audience for being interested in hearing from me again.
Okay. I'll list your Twitter account.
I'm sorry, you asked me a question about,
just, how to find you.
Isa.Blumi Twitter at Twitter or Isa Blumi.
I'll link all of that and your books. And let's talk again soon, and take good care.
Thank you, John. Have a good evening.
Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Isa Blumi. Follow Isa on Twitter at Isa Blumi, ISABLUMI. Find his latest book, Destroying Yemen, What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the World. Find that at ucpress.edu. It's also on Amazon, but UC Press is a preferred place to buy it. The Around the Empire podcast is independent media. Your support's really important. Please pitch in, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. There are many ways to find and listen to this syndicated audio podcast on any mobile podcast app or on the website aroundtheempire.com, on Patreon, or on YouTube. And if you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, subscribe. Also follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.